When the world fell silent, one man chose to rise. The story of Shaun, a slacker-turned-survivor, who faced love, loss, and the undead in a suburban apocalypse, finding redemption, friendship, and purpose amid chaos, as the dead walked and the living struggled to remember what it means to be human. Shaun's life was an endless loop of inertia. He lived in a small house in a London suburb, sharing it with two roommates, Ed, his best friend since childhood, and Pete, a more mature and responsible man who constantly disapproved of their lifestyle. Each day began the same for Shaun. He'd groggily wake up, head to the local corner shop, shuffle past the familiar streets with barely a glance at the world around him, and return home to waste the day away. At work, Shaun manned the floor of an electronics store, a place devoid of any inspiration or ambition. His co-workers were either younger and full of mocking energy, or older and as apathetic as he was. He rarely exerted authority despite technically being in a leadership role. His days were spent enduring lectures from his boss, issuing meaningless instructions, and daydreaming while barely keeping up with responsibilities. Life moved past him in a blur. Outside of work, the one bright spot in Shaun's life was Liz, his long-suffering girlfriend. She wanted more initiative, more effort, more presence. But Shaun, so entrenched in his routine, failed to respond. Their typical dates consisted of nights at the Winchester, the local pub where Ed was always present. Shaun promised changes, but promises without follow-through meant little to Liz. Her two flatmates, Diane and David, had grown increasingly vocal about their distaste for Shaun and his lack of ambition. Liz tried to be patient, but her tolerance was reaching its end. She wanted more than evenings spent surrounded by beer glasses and stale conversation. She wanted a dinner out, a romantic plan, and a grown-up life. Shaun, oblivious or perhaps too complacent to understand the urgency, failed to reserve a table at the restaurant she'd suggested. That minor lapse was enough to tip the scale. When Liz ended things, it felt like a collapse of everything he had left that was meaningful. Heartbroken and frustrated, Shaun returned to the Winchester that night with Ed, drinking himself into oblivion. The two stumbled home late, laughing and joking, unaware of how the world around them had started to shift. News reports had begun to mention an unusual virus. Sirens blared more frequently. People coughed and collapsed in the streets. But Shaun remained insulated in his sorrow, consumed by the failure of his relationship and the dull ache of wasted potential. The next morning, he awoke with a hangover and drifted through his usual routine. Still in a haze, he left the house, walked to the corner shop, and wandered through streets now strewn with signs of chaos. Overturned garbage cans, blood on the pavement, and vehicles abandoned at odd angles. His favorite shopkeeper wasn't behind the counter. The till sat open and unattended. Still, Shaun, lost in his fog, didn't notice the abnormalities. He dropped his coins on the counter and left. Back home, Ed pointed out something strange in the garden. Two people, pale-skinned and shambling, were wandering aimlessly around the yard. Shaun, thinking them drunk, tried to reason with them. But it quickly became apparent these were no ordinary people. One woman, when pushed, fell backward onto a pipe that went clean through her torso, and then stood back up, completely unfazed. The second man continued advancing even after being hit with blunt objects. Panic surged. Shaun and Ed fled back into the house and scrambled to defend themselves. They gathered household items as makeshift weapons, records, kitchen tools, and furniture, and slowly began to understand what they were dealing with. These were zombies. The dead had come back to life. There was no denying it anymore. Switching on the TV brought clarity. News broadcasters, military officials, and scientists all confirmed the unimaginable. A full-scale outbreak had begun. The virus spread through bites and scratches. The infected lost all cognitive function, driven only by the instinct to feed. London was descending into anarchy. The government urged everyone to remain inside and avoid contact with the infected. Shaun's first instinct wasn't to think of himself. He thought of his mother, Barbara. She lived with his stepfather, Philip, a man Shaun never got along with. Though Shaun didn't care for Philip, he couldn't bear the idea of his mother being in danger. He would go to her, bring her to safety, and while at it, rescue Liz. Deep down, he still believed he could fix things with her. And to Shaun, there was only one place they could go. A stronghold in his mind. A place of comfort and security. The Winchester. He mapped out the plan with Ed, writing it step by step as if trying to impose order on the chaos. First, pick up Mum, then get Liz, then take refuge at the pub. With the idea firmly rooted, they set off, grabbing Pete's car. Pete, who had been bitten earlier and had grown increasingly aggressive, was nowhere to be found that morning. His absence was ominous, but the pair pressed forward, the streets now overrun with the undead. Reaching Barbara's house, they found her surprisingly calm. She had been tidying and baking, showing the same quiet grace she always had. But her husband Philip was clearly unwell. His face was pale, his body sluggish. It didn't take long for Shaun to piece together that Philip had been bitten. Despite this, Barbara refused to leave him behind. She insisted he be taken along. Shaun protested, but gave in. The group, now 3, returned to the car and set out for Liz's apartment. Along the way, the transformation of London became clearer. Streets were abandoned with overturned buses and scattered belongings. Zombies roamed freely, attacking anyone they found. Fires smoldered in the distance. The familiar had become foreign. The city was dying. Arriving at Liz's apartment, Shaun pleaded his case. Liz, still angry but shaken by the outbreak, reluctantly joined. Her flatmates, Diane, an aspiring actress with a whimsical air, and David, rational, uptight, and disapproving, came along as well, forming a group of 6. Cramped into Philip's car, they argued over the plan. David suggested going elsewhere, maybe somewhere truly safe like countryside cottages or military bases, but Shaun was adamant. The Winchester, he believed, could withstand anything. Tensions flared within the group. David's disdain for Shaun grew more vocal. Diane tried to mediate. Ed continued to make light of the situation, offering comic relief as fear gnawed at them all. Shaun tried to keep everyone together, taking the lead, but the responsibility weighed heavily on him. During the drive, Philip's condition worsened. He fell unconscious. Shaun, panicking, pulled the car over, but as he opened the door, Philip suddenly jolted awake, but not as the man he once was. He had turned. His eyes were lifeless, his mouth agape, driven by hunger. Shaun was forced to face what he had dreaded. The man who had married his mother was gone. Still, his passing was not without emotion. Before dying, Philip had spoken to Shaun briefly, showing signs of pride and affection, suggesting he had tried in his own way to be a father figure. That small moment of humanity left Shaun shaken. Leaving Philip behind, the group continued on foot. The streets teemed with zombies. A horde shuffled in the distance. It was no longer possible to avoid them by simple stealth. As they reached a backyard leading to a fence behind the Winchester, the group found themselves cut off. In desperation, Shaun used a discarded children's slide to enter the yard, making noise that drew the attention of the undead. Scrambling for a new plan, the group decided to act like zombies themselves, moving stiffly, groaning, and avoiding eye contact. Diane, drawing on her acting experience, coached them on how to mimic the undead. With reluctance, they put on the charade and stumbled across the open space. Miraculously, it worked, at least for a while. They reached the back of the Winchester just as the facade began to crack. Ed's phone rang loudly, attracting unwanted attention. The zombies became agitated. Panic spread. The group tried to find an alternate route, and eventually they located a side door, locked from the inside. They debated how to proceed as the horde closed in, and Shaun, determined to protect the others, ran off, luring the zombies away. The rest of the group managed to break into the pub. Inside, it was dark and empty, dust coating the tabletops, glasses sitting where they had been left days ago. The warmth and laughter that once defined the place had been replaced by a heavy silence. Still, it felt like sanctuary. Shaun returned after some time, bloodied but alive, having shaken off the horde temporarily. He joined the group and tried to rally their spirits, but tensions still simmered. David questioned his leadership. Ed was careless with the jukebox, triggering loud music that drew more attention from outside. Shaun, frustrated, struggled to hold things together. Outside, the dead began to surround the building. Inside, the fractures in the group widened, and the night had only begun. The pub, once a haven of laughter and familiarity, had become a dim, claustrophobic shell of its former self. Outside, the horde of undead gathered, scratching and pressing against the windows, drawn by the echoes of music and life within. Inside, the survivors moved in hushed panic, trying to block entrances with furniture and debris, improvising defenses in a place never meant to withstand siege. The survivors were rattled. Shaun, exhausted and bloodied from his earlier diversion, tried to maintain composure. Liz kept a close watch on him, silently weighing the measure of the man she once knew. Ed, still joking and unfiltered, seemed to not grasp the full gravity of the situation. Or perhaps he understood it better than anyone, but simply refused to let go of levity. Diane remained anxious but willing to help. David, on the other hand, grew increasingly confrontational, his disdain for Shaun's leadership boiling over into muttered gripes and accusatory glances. Barbara, Shaun's mother, sat quietly on one of the pub benches, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale and calm. She looked weaker now. At first, no one noticed, but after a while her hand began to tremble. Then her breathing slowed, and finally the truth emerged. She had been bitten. She hadn't cried out or asked for help. She hadn't wanted to alarm anyone. She had simply tried to go on, believing perhaps that she could will it away. but it had spread. The mark on her arm was clear now, and the color was draining from her with each passing moment. Shaun knelt beside her, barely able to breathe. The woman who had protected and loved him unconditionally was slipping through his fingers. Her final moments were quiet, her expression serene. Then, like all who were infected, she stilled, only to stir again with a guttural rasp, her eyes clouded and empty. The group froze. Shaun, heartbroken and cornered, made the impossible choice. He raised a weapon and ended her suffering before it could truly begin. What followed was chaos. David, sickened by the act, lashed out. The facade of civility shattered as he accused Shaun of weakness, of recklessness, and of bringing ruin upon all of them. Tensions that had simmered finally erupted. Liz and Diane tried to intervene, but emotions surged too fiercely. David snapped and made a move toward the door, insisting on leaving. He attempted to unlock it despite the crowd of zombies outside. As soon as the door cracked open, the horde surged in. Hands reached in through the gap, pulling David violently through the breach. Screams filled the pub as he was overwhelmed and torn apart, dismembered by a crowd of ravenous figures. Diane, shrieking in horror and disbelief, charged after him without pause, vanishing into the sea of bodies. Her fate, though unseen, was inevitable. Now only Shaun, Liz, and Ed remained. They rushed to block the broken entrance, but the defenses had already failed. Zombies poured in from every side, forcing the trio to retreat deeper into the bar. Ed, ever the loyal friend, stood his ground at one point, battling off the undead with ferocity and desperation. But in the chaos, he was bitten. He tried to hide it, brushing it off, making light of his injury. But the blood on his shirt told the truth. Shaun and Liz saw it in his eyes, the acceptance, the resignation. He was dying, and he knew it. Still, he chose to help them escape. The three of them descended into the basement, dragging Ed along despite his protests. Down below, surrounded by beer kegs and storage racks, they found themselves with no way out. The pub above was fully overrun. The sound of moaning and shuffling feet echoed through the floorboards. As they took stock of their situation, Shaun noticed a panel on the wall, an emergency access hatch, likely designed for restocking deliveries. It led to the street, but it was small, narrow, and not designed for multiple people at once. With time short and options fewer still, Shaun made the decision. He and Liz would go. Ed would stay behind. At first, they refused, but Ed insisted, and they saw in his expression a final moment of clarity. He wanted them to live. He didn't want to become a burden. So with great reluctance, Shaun and Liz prepared to leave. They loaded a pistol and counted the remaining bullets. As they turned the wheel on the hatch, sunlight spilled through, a pale, washed-out morning after the longest night of their lives. They crawled out into the open, blinking in the light, and stepped into the street. The scene was apocalyptic. Fires burned in the distance, cars were overturned and still smoking. Corpses lay in heaps, some partially reanimated. But there was also something else, the rhythmic thrum of helicopters, the mechanical clatter of treads on pavement. Around the corner, a military convoy appeared. Soldiers, heavily armed and precise, moved through the streets, executing the undead with clinical efficiency. A commanding officer signaled for Shaun and Liz to get down. Within minutes, the surrounding zombies were dispatched, the horde culled. The siege was over. Shaun and Liz, stunned and trembling, were escorted to safety. Weeks passed. The outbreak, though devastating, had been contained. The military established quarantine zones. Survivors were gathered, processed, and relocated. News programs resumed their broadcasts, sanitized for mass consumption. The true horror of what had occurred was smoothed over by government briefings, entertainment segments, and celebratory montages. The virus was never entirely eradicated, but it was managed. The infected who remained functional were repurposed, used for low-skill labor, background extras in game shows, and novelty segments on daytime television. Society adapted, as it always did, twisting trauma into spectacle. Shaun and Liz moved in together, settling into a modest house in a different part of the city. Their relationship, tested by horror and loss, now had a quiet strength to it. They learned to appreciate small joys, shared breakfasts, peaceful afternoons, the comfort of each other's presence. Yet some parts of the past remained tethered to the present. In the shed out back, where tools and boxes gathered dust, something stirred in the shadows. It was Ed. Or rather, what was left of him. Shaun had chained him up, more out of love than practicality. Ed's infection had run its course, and now he sat in a half-conscious stupor, moving only occasionally, grunting softly. He no longer posed a threat. His teeth were filed down, his instincts dulled. He was a shell of the man he once was. But to Shaun, he was still Ed. Sometimes Shaun would sneak out to the shed, game controller in hand, and sit beside him. They'd play together, as they always had. Their shared hobby now one-sided but still oddly comforting. It was a piece of the old world, preserved in the silence. Shaun had changed. He woke up early. He made plans. He remembered important dates. He talked to Liz with intention, not distraction. The apocalypse had burned away his complacency, leaving behind a man who had been forged in fire, flawed but trying. He never forgot those he'd lost: Barbara, quiet and dignified until the end; Philip, whose final moments revealed more than years of coldness; Diane, whose whimsy became courage; David, whose doubts turned to panic; and Ed, whose friendship had never wavered. The Winchester was gone, consumed by fire and collapse. But its legacy lived on, not in the bricks or the beer, but in the people who had gathered there and what they had meant to each other. Life resumed, not as it once was, but in a new shape. A world forever altered, a future earned through blood, loss, and persistence. In the end, Shaun didn't become a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't a soldier or a scientist or a leader of men. He was simply a man who chose to act when it mattered, who fought for the people he loved, and who found meaning in the aftermath. And on quiet mornings, with birdsong in the air and sunlight peeking through the curtains, he allowed himself to believe that even in a world where the dead had risen, the living could still begin again.